The whole idea of the blanket exercise is not only to educate you, but to also increase your empathy for others. So just understanding other people and other people's perspectives. And then we're going to conclude by having a talking circle, which will be like our debrief session at the end. And that's when you'll have a chance to talk about how it made you feel and anything you'd like to share. So we also like to say that sometimes, well, I should say first of all, this exercise was made for adults. So it is meant, for instance, in Rocky View schools as a professional learning tool for our teachers and educators and all school staff. But we have been using it in the classroom this year quite a bit too. But it can be triggering. So it can be emotional, especially if you have family members that may have been impacted, or you know somebody. Or you may just feel emotional because you're relating to somebody. So some things that we're going to talk about that you should know are going to be in here are residential schools, the 60s Scoop, which is about Indigenous children being taken from their families and being put in non-Indigenous families, so into the foster care system. So we'll be talking about that, the loss of status, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So if you're experiencing any strong emotions at any time, please let one of the adults know in the room that maybe you just want to sit down, maybe you need to step out for a moment, but please check in with an adult, and then we'll make sure that if there are additional supports you need, that we'll make sure that you receive those. Okay, should we just, let's just get to it. Yeah, so I'm going to be playing the role of the European, surprise, surprise, and Cheryl will be our narrator, so she'll be telling the story, and then all of you have different scrolls that we'll be asking you to read throughout the next hour with us.
All right, so let's get started here. So when we begin, we're going to remove our shoes, okay? And so we take our shoes off and you can put them underneath your chair. And the reason that we do that is because as traditional people, we are really tied to our land. And so we are tied to the earth. So what we're going to do is just make this a visual thing that we're going to be tie ourselves to the land, which is the blankets, right? So we just take off our shoes.
You're super uncomfortable. You don't have to do it. And me as the European, I don't have to follow that rule. So I am not taking off my shoes. But the rest of you are playing the role of Indigenous person.
All right, so now you're going to take your blankets that were on your chairs, and you're going to lay them out. And you're going to lay them out so they're not overlapping, but they're touching. So there's no ground showing.
So spread them out, and this is, we're creating our land now. So if you need a help, your buddy can always help you. And just spread them out, and we're going to make our land. And there's one really big blanket, the gray one.
Yeah, I got
he
the
might
really
need
big
help. And I hope our circle's big enough. Fit in here?
Yeah, Jordan.
So no ground showing.
All right, and now let's all step onto the blanket.
If you have artifacts or your scroll, please bring them with you. Come on, get right on there.
Get right on. You guys got to get right on. This is your, you're not on the edges, you're right in there. All right, and now that we're on the blankets, you must not step off unless you are asked to do so. All right? As you step onto the blankets, you are stepping back into time to 11,000 BC, after the meltings of the glaciers when Indigenous people first moved into the area known as Alberta. Moving forward, we begin at the exercise at 15,000 AD, 1500 AD, before the Europeans arrived in this area. You are now in the role of the Inuit, First Nations, and later the Métis people of the land known as Alberta. Now move around the blanket and use it to occupy the land as if you were living on it. Greet each other and trade traditional artifacts.
So if you don't know what your artifact is, have a discussion with a classmate and say, hey, what do you think this is? You can trade. Talk about your artifact. Give it to somebody without an artifact.
I don't know, that's me, you know. I like to look at that.
I mean, I don't know your name yet.
These blankets represent the northern part of Turtle Island, or what we now know as Canada. Before the arrival of Europeans, there is archaeological evidence at Vermilion Lakes that indicate the first human activity in the Bow River area was as early as 10,300 BC, long before the arrival of Europeans. Turtle Island was your home, and the home to millions of people like you. You lived in hundreds of nations. Southern Alberta was partly occupied by the Siouan-speaking people who first brought horses into Alberta and constructed a fort on the Bow River east of what present-day Calgary is. Ancestors of the Blackfoot were nomadic. You moved across the land and with the seasons of the year, following the animals you hunted and planteds you harvested for food. Communal bison jumps such as head-smashing buffalo jump west of Fort Macleod yielded huge supplies of meat. There was a lot of communal support, with everyone looking out for each other, and no one was left without. Everyone had a distinct role to play: men hunting and fishing, and distribution of food in the community, and women were taking care of the home life. Children also helped out by learning from the elders, and herbs were used for medicine and healing. Each community had its own language, culture, tradition, laws, and government. And the communities you often worked together and cooperated with one another. As with all people, sometimes there was conflict. Before the newcomers arrived, one of the ways in which the original peoples ended dispute was by making treaties. The land represented here by the blankets is very important to you. All of your needs, your food, your clothing, your shelter, your culture, and your spirituality are taken care of by the land. In return, it's your responsibility to take care of the land, and you take this responsibility very seriously. Please read scroll number 1.
One of my favorite things about my culture is how we are taught that everything on the earth is to be respected. It's an important part of our culture and covers everything. That includes respecting yourself. Respecting yourself is one of the most important things my culture has taught me. Also, the land, water, plants, air, and animals are all very important to our culture, need to be respected. Without any of it, what would we be? Oh, this is Cattery, a Mohawkie from the community in Quebec.
Things were happening in Europe in the end of the 15th century that would mean a huge change for you. Europeans, explorers, had just, quote unquote, discovered you and your lands. This started fierce competition between European nations.
Without even consulting you, we made deals amongst ourselves and divided up control over you and your lands. Usually, whichever nation discovered your land first took control with the blessing of the Christian Church. This practice is now called the doctrine of discovery.
And so it began, the so-called European discovery of Turtle Island. Please read scroll number 2.
I contacted Europeans. Each of the hundreds of indigenous people of indigenous America possessed all the elements of nationhood that were well established by European settlers: territory, governing structures, legal systems, and a historical continuity with our territories. Nothing since the arrival of Columbus has occurred to merit any reduction in the international legal status of indigenous people. The recognition of indigenous nations and our rights pose no threat to non-indigenous people. Sharon Benny Cree.
Hi there. Nice land you have here. How are you? Hi. Thanks for sharing. This will be your child. Hi there. There you go. Thank you. Hi. Nice weather you guys have here. There you go. This will be your child. There you go. Thank you. Excuse me. There you go. There you go. Good. And there. There's your child.
first arrived on Turtle Island, there were many more Indigenous people than Europeans. The newcomers depended on you for their survival. You helped them to understand how you did things, how you taught your children, and how you took care of the people who were sick, and how you lived off the land in a way that left enough for future generations, and how your governments worked. In the beginning, there was lots of cooperation and support between the settlers. The settlers and the leaders recognized you as the first people. You as having your own governments, your own laws, and territories. They recognized you as an independent nation. They made agreements and treaties with you. These treaties explained how you were going to share the land, the water, the animals, and the plants. These treaties were very important because they were agreements between you and the kings and queens in countries in Europe. They made these arrangements with you because you were here first. The land belonged to you, and you had your own governments and your own the treaties officially recognized your power and independence as a nation. The Europeans understood that they could not force laws or way of life on the people who were here long before they arrived. They understood that you had rights.
In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, King George III said, "Indigenous nations own their lands." The king said that the only legal way newcomers could gain control of those lands was by making treaties between two nations. The year 2013 marked the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation.
Later on, the Government of Canada was formed, and the Royal Proclamation became part of Canadian law. For you, Indigenous people, the treaties were very special and sacred agreements. They were statements of peace, friendship, and sharing. They were based on honesty and respect. Sharing was very important to you. The hunters shared food with everyone, and families helped each other out to raise the children. In these treaties, you tried to help Europeans understand what you meant by sharing. But the Europeans didn't see it that way anymore. Now they had a different view of the treaties. For them, land was something that could be bought or sold. Treaties were a way of getting you, the Indigenous people, to give up your lands. Please read scroll number 3.
Our common memory is lacking. Where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is formed, memory must be created, common memory. Said by George Erasmus, the Name Nation, co-chair of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples.
After a while, you didn't get along very well with the Europeans. When the War of 1812 ended, the Europeans no longer needed you to help them fight with the fighting. As the fur trade dried up, the European newcomers turned to more and more farming and started looking for more land. Before too long, there were more Europeans than Indigenous people. One reason for this was that in the beginning of 1780, European disease came with the fur traders to Alberta. Initial epidemics were particularly deadly, as previously unexposed populations had no resistance. Smallpox claimed thousands of lives. In fact, there are some people who believe that half of the Indigenous people alive at the time died from disease. In some communities, 9 out of 10 people died.
In some places, blankets infected with the deadly smallpox virus were given or traded to Indigenous people by settlers and military leaders, such as Lord Jeffrey Amherst. You represent one of the many Indigenous people who died from smallpox after having come into contact with such blankets. Please step off the blanket and have a seat.
Those of you with white index cards, please step off the blankets. You represent the Aboriginal people who died from various diseases. Please be silent for a moment and remember those who died from the disease.
So if you have a white index
If you have a white index card.
color is yours. You represent the Beothuk, one of the original people of what is now known as Newfoundland. You also died from diseases you'd never seen before, because the Europeans overhunted, some of you starved. Some of you died in violent encounters with settlers trying to take your lands. Some of you were hunted down and killed. In 1829, the last person recognized by the Europeans as your people, Shanaditi, died in St. John's. Your language and your culture became extinct. Please step off the blanket. These two?
Okay, you represent the people who were divided among borders of the United States and British North America, of North America was extended under the London Convention of 1818, from Lake of the Woods across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. This border divided First Nation communities and cuts you off from each other. Please move to separate blankets.
Can one of them stay on
It's okay, you can move. You can move that one. We're gonna move this one. So can you just come over here? We're gonna move you a little farther south into the United States. Okay, so construction of the railway to Winnipeg opened up the prairies to settlers. More land was needed for farming. And in 1867, the government of Canada bought a huge piece of Rupert's land from the Hudson's Bay Company. Overnight, your homeland became Canada's frontier. This was very hard for the Blackfoot, the Cree, and Métis living in the prairies. You, the Métis, fought for your land during the Red River Rebellion and the Northwest Resistance. You won some of these battles, but in the end you were defeated by the government soldiers. You represent those Métis leaders who died in the uprising, or put in jail, or who were executed, such as Louis Riel. Please step off the blanket.
After the rebellion, the Métis people entered a period of dispersion. Fearing for their lives, the Métis people changed their name and fled in all directions, some moving to the United States, while others went back to their First Nation family and became Treaty Indians. Others denied their native heritage altogether. These were dark times for the Métis, a time of persecution and extreme poverty due to their landlessness and general lack of education. Okay.
Great blanket.
In the high Arctic, the Inuit community were moved into isolated, unfamiliar, and barren lands, often with negative consequences. Tuberculosis, epidemic, TB, for example, reached northern communities in the 1950s. By 1956, 1/7 of the entire Inuit population was being treated for TB, while 1/3 of the population overall was affected. A large number of infected individuals died from the disease. Many children were moved from their homes and sent down south for treatment in TB sanatoriums, some never to return. One of these sanatoriums was the Charles Camsell Hospital in Edmonton, operating from 1945 to 1967. In 2010, Health Canada reported the rate of TB among the Inuit is 185 times higher than for the Aboriginal than Canadian non-Aboriginal people.
So you represent people like the Inuit and the Innu at Davis Inlet, along with many other Indigenous communities who suffered and sometimes died because you were forced to move to an unfamiliar place. Please move your blanket away from the others, fold it small, and stand on it. Great.
In 1830, some 40 million bison still roamed North American plains. However, the lucrative rope trade accelerated overhunting of the plains bison by Indigenous groups and white settlers alike. Historians argue that the rise of capitalism ideology drove the Indigenous and white hunters alike to compete for every last animal. A multitude of factors, disease, drought, westward expansion, commercialization and industrial of hunting, colonialism, and induction of domestic animals from Europe caused a near extinction of the bison. By 1878, 48 years later, the remnants of the once great bison herd crossed south into Montana. For those with blue cards, step off the blanket. You represent the ones who died from hunger after being forced off your original lands and away from your hunting grounds.
As more of us arrived, we needed more land. Many of us Europeans thought we were better than other kinds of people, including you. Soon we didn't think of you as friends and partners, but as a problem to be solved. We started ignoring or changing our laws to make it easier for us to take your land. Some land was taken in war, some land was taken after you died.
As Indigenous people, you lost more than just your land. Because the land is so important to you, when it was taken away from you, you also lost your way of living, your culture, and in some cases, the reason to live. Please read scroll number 4.
The idea of terra nullius, which in Latin means land belonging to no one, meant European countries could send out explorers, and when they found land, they could claim it for their nation. These were often lands we were using.
The land wasn't empty, as we Europeans knew it. So we changed the idea to include lands not being used by civilized peoples, or lands not being put to civilized use. It was us who decided what it meant to be civilized. We decided that because you and your people were not using the land in a civilized way, we would take it, and it was almost impossible to stop us.
In 1866, the sacred Manitou stone, sometimes called Old Man Buffalo, was taken from a hilltop near Hardisty by George McDougall, a Methodist missionary. This meteor is said to have been placed on the plains by the Great Spirit after the flood. It was revered as a protector of the buffalo and bringer of peace and prosperity. The belief was that if it's removed, the buffalo would disappear and the person who removed it would be punished. Following the stone's removal, the buffalo did almost disappear. War and disease, starvation visited the Indigenous people. In 1874, McDougall gave the stone to Victoria College in Ontario. In 1972, Victoria College sent the meteorite to the Provincial Museum of Alberta on permanent loan, on the condition that the Provincial Museum undertake consultation with interested First Nations. Requests by the First Nations people have yet to have it returned to its original location thus far have been ignored. Please read scroll number 5.
The BNA Act, also known as the Constitution Act 1867, put Indians and lands reserved for Indians under the control of federal government. When this happened, we lost our rights and control over our lands.
This law gave control of your lands to the government of Canada, in which at time was only made up of people from Europe. You, the Indigenous people, were not involved in the creation of this law that would have such an impact on your lives. More and more, the plan was to try and make you like Europeans. Please read scroll number 6.
In 1876, all the laws dealing with us were gathered together and put into the Indian Act. The Indian Act completely changed our lives. As long as our cultures were strong, it was difficult for the government to take our land, so the government used the Indian Act to attack who were as people. Hunting and fishing were now limited, and spiritual ceremonies like the potlatch, powwow, and Sundance were now against the law. This didn't change until the 1950s.
Now hear this. According to the British North American Act of 1867 and the Indian Act of 1876, you and all your territories are now under the direct control of the Canadian federal government. You will now be placed on reserves. Please fold your blankets until they are just large enough to stand on and not touching other blankets.
Treaty 7 was an agreement between Queen Victoria and several bands that included the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation. In what is today the southern portion of Alberta. Treaty 7 was signed on September 22, 1877 at the Blackfoot crossing of the Bow River at the present-day Siksika Nation, 100 kilometers east of Calgary. The treaty was established reserved land promised The treaty established reserve lands and promised annual payments and/or provisions from the Queen, and promised to continue hunting and trapping rights on the land surrendered. When you went from being a strong, independent First Nations with your own governments to isolated, poor bands that depended on the government for almost everything. You were treated like you knew nothing, like you couldn't even run your own lives. You became responsibility of the federal government. Through the Indian Act, the federal government continues to this day to deny you the basic rights. These rights are things that most Canadians take for granted, such as healthy schools, such as clean running water, and proper housing.
You may not leave your reserve without a permit. You may not vote. You may not get together to talk about your rights. You may not practice your spirituality or your traditional forms of government. If you do any of these things, you may be put into jail. Sit down on your blankets. Scoot them out a bit if you need to. If it's too close, spread it out a bit.
The Indian Act also tried to stop Indigenous people from fighting back to keep their lands. For example, under the Indian Act, it was against the law to raise money to fight for your land rights in the courts until 1950. Two recent settlements of land rights involved Banff National Park. When Banff National Park was formed in 1887, it included the land that had been previously allocated to the First Nations in Treaty 7. The Stoney Nakoda Nation were removed from Banff between 1890 and 1920, even though that was part of their treaty. The park was designed to appeal to sportsmen and tourists. The exclusion policy met the goals of sport hunting, tourism, and game conservation, as well as those attempting to civilize the Indians. Hunting for food was considered savage and uncivilized. According to sportsmen, food came from a farm, and game was to be slaughtered in a certain way. The Stoney people were ousted from living and hunting in the park at this particular time in history, when the government assumed it was acceptable to have non-Indigenous permanent residents. Early on, Banff was popular with the wealthy Americans and European tourists who arrived via the luxury liner, the transatlantic luxury liner, and continued westward on the railways. Guides Jim and Bill Brewster founded one of the first outfitters in Banff, and later Brewsters operated motor coach tours of Banff and Lake Louise. The Stoney people were invited to Banff every year for Indian Days, when tourists would flock to Banff to see real Indians in their natural surroundings, similar to a zoo or a museum. As a result, the Aboriginal people participating in Banff Indian Days were expected to be authentic Indians by adhering to the stereotypes of wearing traditional garb only, for example. As specimens on display, the Nakota were expected to open their teepees to visitors and pose for photographs. Photography became a tool of colonial domination by offering the opportunity of a lifetime to capture and preserve an authentic Indian person in their natural surroundings. In November 2010, Parks Canada and the Stoney Nakoda Nation signed a memorandum of understanding acknowledging the traditional territory, traditional culture, and ceremony use of the land in the park, and giving the band members free access to the park forever. And more recently, in March 2016, the Siksika Nation members voted to accept financial settlement from the Government of Canada to compensate the Siksika for the illegal use of the 70 square kilometer land surrounded Castle Mountain, granted to them in 1892. Please read scroll 7.
I know what the government did in the past. They said where we had to live. I know that we're not treated equally now because I can feel it. We're all Canadians and we should all be treated equally. Cassie, a Mi'kmaq youth from a community in Nova Scotia.
Please read scroll 8.
Under this federal government enfranchisement policy, all First Nations people who became doctors, teachers, lawyers, or soldiers lost their legal Indian status. This was called being granted enfranchisement.
In other words, the government would no longer recognize you as a First Nation person. This cut you off from your community, including First Nation soldiers returning from war, or First Nation lawyers who who were not allowed to fight for their rights of their people.
Can you stand up and just leave your blanket stand somewhere else on the floor? You were enfranchised for serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, gaining a university education, for leaving your reserve for long periods of time, for instance, for employment, and for Aboriginal women, if you married a non-Indian man or if their Indian husband died or abandoned them. Please read Scroll 9.
Assimilation. The government thought the Indian problem would solve itself as more and more Indigenous people died from diseases and others became part of the larger Canadian society. As one government employee said, the government's goal was to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and that there is no Indian problem and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Indian Affairs Deputy Superintendent.
The government of Canada tried in many different ways to assimilate you. For example, in 1969, they introduced the White Paper policy that tried to get rid of your Indian status. The Indian Act, the reserve lands, and the treaties, which were a threat to your right and your identity. Harold Cardinal of the Indian Association of Alberta helped to lead the resistance to create what became known as the Red Paper policy. The Red Paper said that the only way to maintain Indian culture is to remain as Indians. This was contrary to the goal of the federal government throughout the 20th century. Instead of keeping your culture and identity, you had to become more like Europeans by giving up your rights, farming, going to school, and praying in church like them. From the mid-1800s until 1990, the federal government took First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children from your homes, your communities, and put them into boarding schools run by the church. The official partnership between federal government and the churches ended in 1970s, but some churches continued to operate schools until the 1990s. The last residential school in Canada was closed in Fort Capel, Saskatchewan in 1996. The last school in Alberta was closed in 1975, and that was the St. Mary's Mission in Standoff. Please, oh, no, Alberta had 25 residential schools. This was more residential schools than any other province in Canada. Please read Scroll 10.
In the beginning, the authorities believed to achieve assimilation, the bonds between parents and child should be broken. As parents, we didn't have a choice about sending our children to school. Sometimes the police arrived to take away our children. These schools were often very far away from our homes, and the children had to stay at them all or most of the year. In the vast majority of schools, the children were not allowed to speak our languages, and they were punished if they did. Often the children weren't given enough food, and they suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse.
Everyone with yellow cards, raise your hands. You must now move to a separate empty blanket. You represent those who were taken out of your communities and placed in residential schools far away from your homes. While some students say they had a positive experience at school, most of you say that you suffered very bad conditions from different kinds of abuse. Many of you lost connections with your family and they didn't learn your language, your culture, and your traditions. Because you grew up in the school, you rarely went home. Many of you never learned traditional parenting skills. Therefore, your children were negatively affected. This is called intergenerational trauma. And this is the cause. The cause is from residential school. More than 3,000 students died from tuberculosis, malnourishment, and other diseases resulting in poor living conditions while at residential schools. Many of them were buried on school grounds or in unmarked graves, or were never accounted for. Many of you never returned home and had trouble reintegrating if you did. Parents were often not informed if your child was sick, ran away, or even died while at residential school.
The person with the yellow index card marked with an X. Please step off the blanket. You represent one of those thousands of children who died at the schools or who died later as a result. I'm going to ask you to come and join this group here. We're leaving residential schools. So, many of you were welcome back, but you had difficulty fitting in. Some of you experienced lateral violence when you returned home. When you sit down, if you can sit down please, the people in the community, please turn your back on this person and represent the family ties that were damaged because of these intergenerational impacts. Everyone else with yellow cards, I guess that leaves you. Please find a spot nearby on the floor, not on a blanket. You represent those whose connection to your family and community were broken, but you never made it home. Some of you ended up in urban centers, and others ended up incarcerated due to your experience at residential school. Just go stand somewhere else.
Please be silent for another moment to honor those who died at residential school or who never made it home because they lost connection with their families and communities. Please read scroll 11.
You have to remember that the Canadian government has done a lot to Aboriginal people that was meant to make them become like Europeans. For example, in residential schools, my grandmother told me you couldn't speak our language or you'd get beaten. You couldn't see your parents, things like that. If we didn't have voting rights for a long time, we also lost a lot of our culture. Heather, a Cree youth from a community in Saskatchewan.
Even amidst the nationwide policy of assimilation, there are examples of Indigenous people who worked tirelessly to keep their culture and control of their own education. In 1970, a member of the satellite community, First Nation community near St. Paul, publicly protested the living conditions at residential school in their community. They peacefully took the Blue Quails building and transformed it into the Indigenous Controlled Education Center. In the first, sorry, I'll read that all over again. Even in the midst of a nationwide policy of assimilation, there are examples of Indigenous community who work tirelessly to keep their community and control of their own education. In 1970, members of the Satellite First Nations near St. Paul publicly protested the living conditions at residential school in their community. They peacefully took over the Blue Quails community building and transformed it into the first Indigenous Controlled Education Center in Canada. Similarly, in 1986, the Blood Tribe members funded Red Crow College, formerly St. Mary's Residential School, and thousands of students have graduated from Blue Quails First Nations College, now a university, and Red Crow College. Both institutes offer post-secondary programs to promote pride in Indigenous language, traditions, and cultural teachings.
Please unfold a corner of your blankets to acknowledge First Nations control of local education. Thanks to the courage of survivors, Canadians started to find out about residential schools. Former students negotiated a settlement agreement that included the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2008, Prime Minister Harper apologized for the residential schools, and here's an excerpt of his apology. To the approximately 80,000 living former students and all the family members and communities, the Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant culture and traditions, and we do apologize for having done this. Not only did you suffer these abuses as children, But as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry.
But apologizing means you have to change what you are doing. Many people are still waiting to see if Canada will change how it treats Indigenous children. Residential schools are not just a part of our history. The children, grandchildren of the people who went to the schools feel the impact. Many former students are alive today and some have the chance to tell their stories to Canadians through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But Indigenous children are still treated differently. Your schools don't get as much money. Today, you are even more likely to be taken from your community, but this time, you are being placed into foster care. Please read Scroll 12.
From the 1960s to the 1980s, thousands of First Nations and Métis children were forced from our homes and adopted or fostered, usually by non-Aboriginal people. This period is known as the 60s Scoop. Many of these kids experienced violence, racism, and abuse and lost connection to their identity and culture. Like residential schools, the purpose of the 60s Scoop was assimilation.
You represent a child apprehended from your community during the 60s Scoop. You were not able to reintegrate into your extended family and territory, leaving you with a sense of loss. Please find a spot on the floor nearby. This is a foster home for you.
Not Hugo.
Hugo's going to a foster home. Non-Indigenous. Please read Scroll 13.
Shannon Kustachin of the Ottawa-Piscat First Nations had a dream. Safe and comfy schools for the First Nations children and youth, and classes that respected First Nations cultures. She worked tirelessly to convince the federal government to give First Nations children a proper education and fair funding.
Please read Scroll 14.
Shannon said, I want to tell you what it's like to never have the chance to feel excited about being educated. It's hard to feel pride when our classrooms are cold, the mice run over our lunches, and when you don't have proper resources like libraries and science labs. You know that kids in other communities have proper schools, so you begin to feel as if you are a child who doesn't count for anything. We want our younger brothers and sisters to go to school thinking that school is a time for hopes and dreams of the future. Every kid deserves this.
Sadly, Shannon passed away in a car accident when she was 15. But the movement she started lives on. It's called Shannon's Dream. Please unfold one corner of your blanket and give yourself a round of applause for the young Indigenous leaders like Shannon who are bringing about positive change. Others continue to fight for the rights of Indigenous children. Cindy Blackstock, a member of the Kiksan Nation in British Columbia, launched a human rights complaint in 2007, alleging that the Government of Canada discriminates against the First Nation children by consistently underfunding child welfare on reserves. After a long legal battle through the provincial and federal courts, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in April 2016 ruled in a landmark decision that the federal government had a long-standing practice of underfunding child and family services on First Nations, and failing to ensure that the First Nations children have access to government service the same terms as other Canadian children. The federal government was ordered to cease its discriminatory practice, but has yet to comply with this ruling. Please unfold a corner of your blanket and give a round of applause for Cindy Blackstone. Please read Scroll 15.
Over the years, more than 70% of the land set aside for us in the treaties has been lost or stolen, and big companies are allowed to make significant amounts of money from Indigenous lands and natural resources. We, the Indigenous peoples, get little, but are left to clean up the mess and pollution to companies that don't respect the earth or future generations.
Please read Scroll 16.
First Nations are nations. First Nations, treaty people, signed over 300 treaties with the Europeans during the 1700s and 1800s. The treaties agreed to share the lands and resources with the immigrants. Under existing legislation, treaty people are sovereign nations. The Indians surrendered over 9.9 million square kilometers of their land to the immigrants. Today, the sons of the immigrants have the largest treaty rights in Canada. The Indians have become the poorest peoples in Canada. Chief Pascal Bayeti, Putakawagan First Nation.
One way the Canadian government pressures Indigenous peoples to leave their lands and assimilate is by failing to provide enough funds for basic services. According to the Office of the Auditor General, 2011, over half the drinking water systems on reserve pose a significant risk to human health. According to the Assembly of First Nations, 2012, there are 85,000 new housing units needed on reserves, and 60% of existing houses are in need of repair. According to the Public Health Agency of Canada, 2011, rates of suicide are high in First Nations communities, and even higher in many Inuit communities. Among First Nations communities, suicide rates are twice the national average, and show no signs of decreasing. Suicide rates among Inuit are even among Inuit are even higher than among First Nations, at 6 to 11 times higher than the Canadian average. Please read scroll 17.
For many of us, women are carriers of our culture. By targeting women, you target the heart of the nation. Indigenous women have been targeted through federal legislation and policies that try to wear down our communities, and in doing so, make it easier to take our lands. Residential schools have left a legacy of violence that contributes directly to abuse, especially abuse directed at women and children. And in wider society, everyday racism causes wounds that are both visible and invisible. According to Statistics Canada 2009, Indigenous women are at least 3.5 times as likely to experience violence as non-Indigenous women in Canada. According to a 2014 report by the RCMP, over 1,000 Indigenous women have gone missing or have been murdered since the 1970s, and these are only the cases that have been documented. The real number is certainly much higher.
Gender inequality in the Indian Act meant that Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men lost their legal Indian status, but non-Indigenous women who married Indigenous men gained Indian status. Some women who lost their Indian status took their cases for reinstatement to the United Nations, and eventually the Supreme Court of Canada, the court decided against them by 1 vote, but advised the Canadian government to correct the change of its discriminatory practice. Parliament acted and passed Bill C-31 in 1985, which restored the status to those who have been forcibly enfranchised by gender discrimination, and have not been fully removed from the Indian Act. So in other words, what it's saying is they made the bill, but it's actually still law. They didn't actually change the law.
You represent one of the women stripped of your status because of this gender inequality in the Indian Act. As a result, you have had to leave your community. Please find a spot nearby on the floor.
In 2007, a step was taken to improve the way that Indigenous people were treated. The UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People became part of international law. This agreement among the world governments is that a minimum standard to make sure that Indigenous people survive and thrive. Chief Wilton Littlechild from Ermiskin Cree Nation, the first treaty Indian from Alberta to become a lawyer and former commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was one of the authors of this document. Canada, however, was one of the 4 countries to object to this declaration in 2007. Those 4 countries were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. In May 2016, the Government of Canada changed its position and announced that the United Nations Assembly of that Canada is now in full support of the declaration without hesitation. And we need to make sure that this is put into action. Despite the Government of Canada's century of efforts to take away your identity as Indigenous people, you have continued to resist and pass down your language, your ceremonies, and much more. Please unfold a small corner of your blanket to honor the people who wrote the declaration and worked to get it adopted. Give yourselves a round of applause. Please read scroll 18.
We have language immersion programs and healing initiatives based on our traditional values. Our elders are passing on land-based skills to our youth, and mothers and grandmothers are working to address violence in our nations by sustaining ceremonies that honor women. Our leaders are using the courts to have our rights recognized, and many of our nations are growing. We see treaties as living agreements that, if respected, will allow people from all backgrounds to share the land peacefully and respectfully. We are strong and resilient, having survived centuries of efforts to make us disappear.
Please read scroll 19.
To us, the answer is not about incremental change. It is not about the concrete action. It is also repairing the relationship. And the way to repair this relationship between us and Canada is to have this country acknowledge that its richness and its wealth come from the one-sided interpretation of the treaties. There has to be henceforth a double understanding of what those treaties represent. Ovid Macready, Crown First Nations Gathering 2012.
In June 2009, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, was established, and commissioners were appointed. The commission hosted 7 national events across Canada, as well as closing events in Ottawa, with the goal of hearing from former students, engaging the Canadian public, and providing education about the history and legacy of residential school system, and sharing and honoring the experience of former students and their families. At the closing events in June 2015, the TRC released its executive summary, which included its findings and 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential school and advancing the process of reconciliation in Canada. Please read scroll 20.
The role of culture in the reconciliation process, I think, is that both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal cultures alike must respect one another in light of their historical experiences. They have to see eye to eye on healing, so to speak. By this, I mean that there needs to be maximized understanding and trust built between the cultures involved. David Joancy from the Kingate, Cape Dorset Inuit community.
Please read scroll 21.
Despite their assimilation attempts, despite the residential school systems, despite the strong influences of the church and Métis communities to ignore and deny our Aboriginal heritage, despite not having a land base, and despite our own diversity and heritage, we are still able to say we are proud to be Métis. We are resident as weed and beautiful as a wildflower. We have much to celebrate and be proud of. Christy Belcourt, Métis artist.
Please read scroll 22.
Our leaders need to show the way, but no matter how many deals and agreements they make, it is in our daily conversations and interactions that our success as a nation in forging a better place will ultimately be measured. It is what we say to and about each other in public and in private that we need to look at changing. Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
The violence of colonization has left a lot of pain. All across Canada, the relationship between Indigenous people and the newcomers is often broken. We don't need any more broken promises. We need to repair the relationship. And to do this, we need real change.